Russians have and that the Chinese have. So it's about to get very, very interesting as we kick that rock over.
You know, the thing, and I think the host of the News Nation special, the follow-up analysis show, made this point multiple times. I think the biggest thing for a lot of people is the ontological shock. The fact that Grusch really did, Dave Grusch has really made some quite extraordinary allegations. And the one that I was holding my breath and I was listening to it on the IFB audio as it was going out. I couldn't see it, but I was listening to it. It's the moment when Dave is asked, have people been killed to protect this secret? And people wonder why there's a resistance to revealing the existence of the program when you have a former very senior intelligence official saying that his understanding, his strong suspicion is that there have been people who have been murdered to protect this secret. We're talking here about crimes, Bryce. And then when people ask me, what am I scared of? That's what I was scared of. I'm scared of the fact that there are grave crimes committed allegedly by people in the executive arm of government and possibly also in a private aerospace contractor to conceal this secret. What have they done?
What have they done?
Is it any surprise that they don't want to talk about it? So
not to me. It was interesting, though, when I did that first interview in the a couple hours before the special, that's the very first question the anchorwoman asked me was about people getting killed. So, I mean, that really, shot up as something that they're very interested in. And obviously, boy, that leaves some digging to be done. I did want to talk about ontological shock, though, because the anchor of the what are we going to call this? There's the special, and then there's the follow-up. I don't know what
the post-show analysis.
The post-show analysis. Yeah. He said several times. First of all, I like the guy, Brian, and I'm blanking on his last name, Enton, or do you remember? Sorry, Brian. But he said 3 times, I think, how part of the problem was he just couldn't seem to get his brain around, yes, he hears people say these things, but they're so shocking. It's just, you want to not believe it. And I understand that. I've experienced that so many times in the last couple of weeks, particularly this last week, as people have been talking about it, where I will tell people what's happening and so forth, and they'll listen politely, but there's no follow-up question a lot of times because they're just not prepared to hear about crash wreckage and intact craft and bodies and reverse engineering. It's just too much. When you're talking about, well, I saw this light in the sky and it was impossible, somehow that's not ontological shock. People can relate to that. But the specificity of what Dave Grusch has said in your special tonight was a lot. And I think it's going to take a while for people to process this. And that may be exactly what's going on right now.
Yeah, I found Brian Enton's comments quite interesting because I think he was speaking for a lot of people in his audience. It's a very, very confronting thing to hear a person making these extraordinary claims. And I think you and I have heard them so many times now. You and I must have discussed this in secret so many times in the last month or so. And the simple reality is there's an adjustment that's going to have to take place. Yes. If Grusch is telling the truth, and I think he is telling the truth, and I've satisfied myself with independent sources that he's telling the truth. If he is telling the truth, it means that this planet has been deceived for many, many decades. We've been lied to. There's been a cover-up. We've been told to ridicule something that was in fact very, very real. The human race has been the victim of the most extraordinary disinformation operation. And it's been an incredibly successful one. I mean, it's such a taboo subject that even now, as people are being told by a former very senior intelligence official that it's real, that there are NHI, non-human intelligence, that yes, we do have craft. That's the allegation. The very time that we're telling that, I think people are going to have trouble processing it. And I'm not surprised at all that people are still going to be skeptical. But that's the issue. The issue is we know for a fact that he has made these allegations under oath and that they have been verified as credible by the Inspector General. And we know for a fact that he's given evidence to them under oath to the various House committees. And so on that basis alone, it's incumbent on the American people now to start rattling the cage and asking their government, what are you hiding? And why are you hiding it?
On that topic, obviously you did a lot more media than I did. I did a couple of things, but two stand out to me this week. I talked to Chris Cuomo, who's on News Nation, and I talked to Laura Ingraham, who's on Fox News. Now, these are people that charitably are on different sides of the political spectrum, and let's not even get into that. But they both kind of said the same thing in their questions and statements surrounding this interview, the interview I did with each of them, which was both of them mirrored what you were just saying, where there's these accusations that the government hasn't been fully forthcoming, and both of them took the position, well, enough of that. There's an easy answer to all of this. Let's just investigate it like we would anything else, and let's get started now. Their impatience with more nonsense and dilly-dallying about this thing was palpable. And I thought it was kind of refreshing, because that's certainly not the way all news goes. And I'll give you another example. I can't remember. It's late at night, folks, but I can't remember the name of the president's press secretary, Valjean or something. I'm sorry, it's late. But she was asked about this week. And she said, well,
Corinne Jean-Pierre, friendly Rich has told us.
Valjean, I don't know what, I'm completely whatever. But what I thought was interesting is this woman said, and she sort of had a smile, and therefore the reporter had to sort of smile back. And she said, well, you'll have to ask the Department of Defense about that. And I thought, what kind of statement is that? The press secretary gets up there day after day after day and talks about all kinds of things. The press secretary talks about pardoning turkeys at Thanksgiving. For crying out loud, why is the press secretary saying that that's something that this White House is going to laugh and smirk about and refuse to answer the question?
More importantly, Bryce, why are the media complicit in letting her get away with that? Because this is the problem. This is where I think the media starts needing to hold the feet to the fire. I mean, quite a number of people have talked to me about the fact that that era of great American investigative journalism is very historic. It's very in the past. But, there are some great American investigative journalists. I'm friends with some of them. They're good people. Yep. But what's happening in America, I think, is with the UFO subject, the UAP subject, there's almost a kind of a fear, a taboo, a stigma that makes people think, oh my God, I can't touch that subject. Let's just laugh about it nervously. And it's quite ridiculous, because we now know beyond any shadow of a doubt that there is at least a prima facie case to suggest that the government is involved in a monstrous cover-up. And it's quite fun. I love it. It's hilarious to me as a journalist that people aren't following it. And I mean, to me, I just want to put another boot up the butt of was it the New York Times? It was the New York Times. What's his name? Ross Douthat. Or doubted. Right. He certainly doubted it. There was an op-ed piece by
someone's going to fact check all our names from this night. You're exhausted and I'm exhausted, so it's okay. We get a pass tonight.
But no, there was an op-ed piece by a guy from the New York Times, which came out in the last couple of days, and we were all holding our breath, waiting for the killer punch to try and attack Dave Grusch's credibility. And hilariously, what they did was attempt a slur by linking the very controversial Bob Lazar with the allegations of Dave Grusch. And I've remained very agnostic on Bob Lazar's claims in my book and in subsequent commentary, because I do think Lazar has lied about his educational record, and there are inconsistencies in his story that make me strongly doubt that he would ever have been given a security classification that would have given him access to Area 51 and to see alleged craft that have been retrieved by the US government. And so what the New York Times did was try and associate that quite easily discredited figure with Grusch. And that wasn't journalism. That was just a smear job. That was a grubby little smear job. And the thing that really shocks me is if that's the best they can come up with, it means they're really scrambling. And we're in a really weird situation now where the mainstream papers in your country have dropped the ball. And look, the same thing happens in my country. You know, I was invited on to a TV show on another TV network other than the one that I work on, and I wisely elected not to go on it because ultimately what happened was the TV show did the usual X-Files theme and ridiculed the whole subject matter, lots of titters off camera. And you just think, I don't want to be part of that anymore. We don't have to tolerate that kind of nonsensical journalism anymore. Belittling the subject is no longer legitimate because we're now in an era where even the US government admits that this phenomenon is real, anomalous, and unexplained. I mean, even the head of ARO, Dr. Sean Kirkpatrick, has talked about anomalous metal spheres moving in extraordinarily unusual maneuvers. I mean, at what point do people go, gee, there really is something to this?
So I think we should probably give a shout out to the folks at News Nation, who I thought rather courageously embraced telling this story, devoted a lot of airtime to expanding on it, and made the special an event by building the content before and after it. And at least the contacts I had with the folks at News Nation, I didn't see any snickering or goofing about. I felt that they sort of took it head on. So hats off. Good job.
Yep.
Hey, you know,
no,
Ross,
I agree.
Yeah.
Can I just emphasize one thing? I mean,
please.
I really liked what Brian Enton said at the end of that program, where he actually said, look, you know, what we've tried to do is we've tried to take this issue objectively and without ridicule. You know, we've tried to engage with the subject and treat people with respect. And that's what I really admire about what News Nation's done. They're a small news organization. They're not one of the big hitters, but they're hungry. And you could sense the pride and the hunger for the story that they had in their newsroom. I was really touched by the kind comments that I got coming down the earpiece during the ad breaks from people in the newsroom who were clearly excited and thrilled that their network has this story and that it's breaking news. That's a fantastic thing. That's all journalists ever want to do.
It was inspiring to me. And, you know, I was just going to say, we can wrap this up pretty soon because I think everybody needs some sleep, but we can come back this week with a little more time to consider this and talk a little bit more and extend some of these things. But one of the things we did right before we went on is I asked the people on Twitter, if you have any questions you want us to handle, send them to us. So, you know, Ross, do you want to play speed chess here? And I just hit you with some questions and we keep them fast and short and then say goodnight and get out of here. Okay, so here's a couple of them that I think were raised by the special that you were doing and then the questions that were asked afterwards. The one that really struck home to me was, is Dave Grusch safe? Do you think he's safe?
I think he is now. I think he's a lot safer now that he's taken a public position. There are things that have happened to Dave that aren't very nice. His home's been broken into and he's been targeted with surveillance and I think he's been harassed. And I've got a pretty good idea who the people are that have been doing the harassing. It's quite extraordinary. It's probably not a government agency. It's probably a private contractor. More on that later.
Wow. So, all right. Well, okay. I was just going to say, are you going to be looking into that? I guess the answer is yes. Here's another, are you going to be looking into it question. You raised in that special that the Vatican has known about this for a while. What should happen about that? Should the Vatican, how do you get the Vatican legitimately on the record about what they know about the UFO situation?
Well, one of the things that I think is the red flag with the Vatican is that a few years ago, the Vatican astronomer made a very public statement that we are all God's children, whatever we are. If we're another species, we're still God's children. And that the Christian faith, they emphasized, is not incompatible with the belief in aliens. And I think the Vatican's been aware of this issue since at least the Second World War, when the Magenta craft was recovered. And I think that the Vatican apparently, my good friend Diana Walsh-Pasulka, the theologian professor, has apparently gone to the Vatican Library in the past. And she's told me that there are enormous archives in the Vatican still to be released where they've been studying the phenomena through millennia.
It is, that is pretty amazing. But on the other hand, it makes good sense, particularly if that first crash was in Italy, as he said. All right. Will there be interviews to follow with people who literally have first-person knowledge, the people who say, yes, I worked on this program, I touched that craft. I saw this body. Are we going to get that kind of thing coming anytime soon?
Yes.
Okay. Let's leave it at that because and keep well, you got it's TV. You got to tease a little bit. Okay. Also, is there any information that it was implied that there might have been agreements between humans and the NHI? Is there any specific information on any agreements that may or may not have been made?
Not from Dave, but of course, you and I can both speculate about the fact that there's long been in UFO mythology stories of a meeting at Holloman Air Force Base.
Right.
Depends what year, depending on what story you hear, but the best one I've heard is around about 1966. This wasn't one where a president was involved, but this involved military officials allegedly meeting non-human intelligences coming off a craft. I'm not in a position to be able to assert that I have sources that say to me that this is a true incident. But yeah, I was as amazed as everybody else when I heard Dave confirm the fact that he was talking about agreements with aliens. And more importantly, it's quite something to read it in the DOPSA file to actually see that the government, the Defence Office of Pre-Publication Security Review, actually authorized Mr. Grusch to talk about that. And just to make this point again, Bryce, I really want to drive this home. There are people in the defence and intelligence community who are good people. Not everybody in the defence and intelligence community are villains in this matter. There are really good people who've taken the position that there really is no good reason to keep this secret for another 80 years. And so that's why I think, in part, the DOPSA review happened. But they're not making it easy for us. They've obviously known that Dave was going to go public. I don't think they knew about my TV interview, but they certainly knew that Leslie Kean and Ralph Blumenthal were working on a story. And I guess I was expecting more of a blowback. I was expecting a more definitive attack on Mr. Grusch, but there isn't one.
Well,
and I'm quite amazed, actually, that in the week since this story has been out, nobody has really laid a glove on his credibility. And in fact, there's been a conga line of friends of his who've come out in support of him on social media and in the Leslie Kean, Ralph Blumenthal article, testifying as to not only his credibility, but as to the truth of what he says. As Carl Nell, former Colonel Carl Nell, has testified, we are indeed not alone. It's quite extraordinary. And people keep on missing that. When Mick West talks about how, there's no evidence, the simple fact is there is evidence. There are people on the record. We send people to jail on the basis of witness evidence. Hearsay evidence on occasion is admissible in a court of law. So the notion, there's no evidence, bullshit. I'm calling it bullshit. And more importantly, the evidence is there before the various Senate and House committees and before the Inspector General. And if the Congress wants to do its job properly, it can start extracting that evidence in open public hearings, and the public can hear about it for the first time. I know a lot of what it is, not from Dave Grusch, but from other people. And boy, I really want the public to know, because there is no good reason. The public needs to know.
They do need to know. Ross, I look forward to turning you doing an impression of Mick West saying there's no evidence into a GIF. That would be insane. I hope somebody
please
was
don't
listening
encourage
to it.
people.
My
wife is already annoyed. My wife is already annoyed that I swear occasionally, and apparently on one or two occasions.
All right, don't make that GIF, anybody. Okay, here's a serious one though. As you and I have stated, people are interested in the process too, the sort of the journalistic process. And as we've said, you actually got a chance to talk to Dave on camera twice, on May 8th here in Los Angeles as kind of that safety backup interview, and then the News Nation interview on May 9th. So that means you had the guy on tape fully on May 9th. Why didn't News Nation and you go forward faster? Why allow the debrief to sort of go first? Why did that happen?
Look, part of it is I've got huge respect for Leslie and Ralph Blumenthal. I think it was important to have their written story ready first. I think we were all hoping, to be perfectly honest, that they would have been able to place it in the Washington Post, which is a well-known, highly reputable newspaper of record. We did think at one stage about scooping Leslie and Ralph, but I'm a nice bloke. The bottom line is we were talking to Dave all at the same time. I guess we could have done if we'd wanted to, but I'm not really interested in playing silly games by trying to scoop colleagues. I'm more interested in responsibly getting the information out there. And I thought that the best way to do it was to contemporaneously broadcast at the same time as Leslie and Ralph's debrief article came out.
Listen, it was. Go ahead. Please finish.
No, I was disappointed that it went in the debrief, even though I've got huge respect for my colleagues at the debrief. But to me, it's a failure of mainstream media that the Washington Post dragged the chain. They didn't knock it back completely, but they dragged the chain and delayed their decision on whether or not to publish. And the New York Times did knock it back, which is a decision I'm sure that future history will show they will have cause to regret. I guess maybe the lesson of this whole experience this evening is that they'll now realize that there are nimbler social media platforms like ours. There are online platforms now that are in danger of making the mainstream media irrelevant if it doesn't start engaging with this issue.
And it isn't, it depends on how you define mainstream, but just for the record, the Kane and Blumenthal piece was, I don't know whether you want to use the word past, but the New York Times had first look, then the Washington Post had a look, then the Hill had a look, and then Politico had a look. And for various reasons, it didn't go to any of those, ended up on the debrief, which is, kind of a strange commentary on exactly what you've been talking about, Ross, how hard it is to get, New York Times, Washington Post, that's sort of way up there, and they wouldn't touch it. Then you have the Hill and Politico, and they wouldn't, or either they wouldn't touch it or they didn't feel they had the time to do the work properly to get into it. Listen, just about to get out of here, but I think there's a piece of housekeeping that people are interested in. A lot of people have said they had a hard time watching it, and part of that is because News Nation is new. And I've had to explain many times to people, if you want to see anything on News Nation, you have to go to their website, joinnn.com, and all that. But you guys are the reporters here. Now, let's go back to this issue that you just raised. Is the reason that there is reticence and pushback on... Hello there, I'm Bryce Zabel, and you're listening to Need to Know. And as you recall, chance of having a small effect by being a whistleblower.
The U.S. may have a secret UFO retrieval program. Those are just some of the incredible claims laid out by the Pentagon UFO whistleblower David Grusch. Now, among the claims from Grusch is that the government has a non-human aircraft in its possession, which has been kept secret from both Congress and the public. He recently filed a whistleblower complaint claiming that he gave classified proof to Congress and the Intelligence Community Inspector General. But while News Nation has confirmed Grusch's credentials, we have not seen nor verified the alleged proof that he claims to have given to investigators. Here to help me break down some of these claims, Bryce Zabel. It's good to see him again, filmmaker and host of the Need to Know podcast. Bryce, thanks for being here.
Hi, Natasha. It's good to be here, and it's such an important day. Thank you.
We know the Inspector General of the Intelligence Service has said that Grusch's complaint is credible. What is your reaction to the whistleblower?
Leans in that direction. I don't want to put words in his mouth, but we had some very long conversations about that. So whatever the case may be, guys, we went there, we did this. It's there for you to see on my Instagram right now.
Grusch sat down with investigative journalist Ross Coulthart, who is reporting for News Nation on the bombshell whistleblower complaint filed with Congress and the...
In recent reporting, author Michael Schellenberger writes that multiple sources have confirmed whistleblower David Grusch's claim that the United States government possesses a number of non-human vehicles. These sources are, quote, either high-ranking intelligence officials, former intelligence officials, or individuals who could be verified as being involved in the United States government UAP efforts for 3 or more decades, according to his reporting.
Schellenberger writes that the individuals said they had seen or been presented with, quote, credible and verifiable evidence that the U.S. government and U.S. military contractors possess at least 12 or more alien spacecraft, some of which they shared with AARO or the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, quote, which...
And the claim here is that these craft are real physical objects. This is not a mass hallucination, that they exist in specific military bases or in contractor facilities, and that members of Congress could go and actually find these facilities, or go and actually make sure they get their way in there and try to find these craft themselves.
So obviously this is amazing that we have the craft at all, but I can't help but wonder, were there pilots of the craft? Do we know anything about that? Is there anything you can say to that effect?
David Grusch, the whistleblower, did say on News Nation that there were, in some cases, non-human pilots.
What?
I did have confirmation of that from one of my sources. I kept it out of the story in part because it was one source, and also I felt like I really wanted to establish that there is strong evidence that there are craft, and I didn't want to get too much into what I had been told about the different potential of there being beings. It's a lot of ontological shock with just the craft, and I felt like, let's just give this a minute and let's spend a little bit more time doing this reporting. I would also say I'm not the only person that's interviewing these folks. There are other people in my article. I mentioned former Assistant Defense Secretary Christopher Mellon mentioned at least 4 witnesses. I think he said in his article in Politico over 4 people. I don't know if those are the same people I spoke to. We don't share information with each other, but there's more people that are finding the courage to speak. They're very scared. They don't want to lose security clearance, and they're also worried about retaliation. And David Grusch, as you know, the whistleblower, felt like he needed to go to Congress because he was subject to retaliation.
I actually have chills right now hearing that there were potentially non-human pilots that were recovered along with the craft. That suggests to me that these were craft that crashed in some way, and that's how the U.S. military was able to recover them. Is that correct?
Well, actually, that's there are cases of that. There are people that say that there were crashes. There's also cases of what they call this a retrieval program. There's also cases, I was told, of craft being abandoned and craft making its way into U.S. military hands in other ways. And so I think that it's not just there is crash evidence, but there's also other mechanisms in which these craft have been obtained by the U.S. military.
So it sounds like, from what you're saying, your contacts are based in the United States. You've talked to military officials, people in the intelligence community in the United States. This figure, 12 or more, is specific to the crafts obtained by the U.S. military. Do we know anything more about potential crafts or pilots globally?
Well, Grusch, the whistleblower, said in his statements that there is competition between the United States, China, and Russia in terms of developing reverse engineering these technologies. I should say that was not something I was able to confirm. And it wasn't that people disconfirmed it or denied it. It was just that the people I spoke to did not know that if Russia or China had these technologies or similar craft. I would also say, just on a personal level, I felt comfortable doing this story in part because of Grusch's whistleblower testimony. Like the people I interviewed, I felt like somebody needed to kind of speak up and say that what he's saying is not unusual, that you can find a fair amount of people that will talk about this off the record, or in my case, not for attribution. I will say I haven't written any commentary about the piece itself. I am planning on writing more about it, but I have actually been interviewing people for several years and only felt comfortable at this point, and in part I felt obliged to share this research and to go back to folks. But I've been talking to folks for a long time, in part because you may know I have spent a long time working on nuclear energy. Nuclear energy is a dual-use technology, and it was actually in that work that I started to come across a lot of evidence of UFOs, or what have been rebranded UAPs, but a significant amount of interaction of these UAPs and UFOs, including the most famous alleged crash in history occurred around nuclear weapons test sites and also nuclear weapon sites.
Is there any connection, Michael, between this existence of the UFOs or the non-human entities and nuclear research?
There's definitely something going on that I certainly don't entirely understand. There's, in fact, there's a major book. I've interviewed the author of it called UFOs and Nukes that describes many cases of anomalous UFO activity around nuclear weapons sites, but there's also been significant UFO sightings and reports around nuclear power plants. The nature of those interactions suggests that whatever is behind those craft is expressing some concern around these sites. I'm very reluctant to get too far into it, in part because I'm a big supporter of nuclear energy. I think it's the only way to really address climate change and other important environmental issues. So, but nonetheless, nuclear obviously is as a weapon, is a very powerful and potentially dangerous technology. And so it does seem like there is something big going on there. And I would just note, we have civilian control of our military in the United States. And we've now done stories on FBI whistleblowers, and we're very concerned about the role of the intelligence community in encouraging censorship by social media platforms. And for me, even though I have been looking at this particular issue for a long time, we have a situation here where we have a very important whistleblower who the intelligence community's inspector general said has credible and urgent information. We have the DOD's special department on this, which is called ARROW. In April, the director of that program said that there was no credible evidence. The inspector general contradicted that. That now the DOD spokesperson told us and others that there's no verifiable evidence. However, this evidence does appear to be verifiable. You need to go into these facilities and look for these craft. I think there may be resistance, but again, we have civilian control over our militaries. And I think there needs to be a very clear statement from members of Congress, particularly Senators Rubio and Gillibrand, that this is not up to the military to decide what to withhold from us. This is the right of the American people to know what our tax dollars and what our militaries are doing. And if there has been some bad behavior, we know there's been cover-ups. And by the way, I will point out, this is a New York Times story from 1978, New York Times Magazine story about Pentagon covering up of UFO information. So for me, if there's nothing there, and we should keep an open mind that maybe there is nothing there, we keep an open mind on both levels, the military needs to open up. It's way past time for this. It's civilian control of our military and intelligence services. And I'm afraid that we're not seeing the levels of disclosure that I think that we deserve to see. It is ontological shock, but I do think we are grown-ups and we're capable of dealing with whatever the truth may be.
Absolutely, couldn't agree more. This is in the public interest. So thank you so much for joining us, Michael Schellenberger, and congratulations on the good reporting.
Thank you for having me.
David Charles Grusch, a whistleblower who previously served as an intelligence official and a veteran of the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, has provided Congress and the intelligence community Inspector General with highly classified information. According to Grusch, this information pertains to covert programs that have successfully obtained both fully intact and partially intact non-human aircraft. Journalists Leslie Kane and Ralph Blumenthal explains how this breaking news story came to light. Join us as we get rebelliously curious. Ralph and Leslie, thank you so much for joining me on Rebelliously Curious today. The past 24 hours for me and everyone at the debrief has been unbelievable, and we thank you for bringing this story to us. So thank you for joining me today.
Thank you.
Percy, it's really great to be with you.
Good to see you too. So this is a bombshell of a story. Can you start off by mostly people know now, but for some people that maybe is just catching up to this, and we'll have some of those people as well, can you explain how this started with Dave Grusch and how you ended up getting the story and some of the moving parts of how this all came to be?
I had heard about Dave Grusch for a while from various sources that I have who know him. It's sort of a group of people that I'm in contact with pretty regularly. And I was introduced to him in early March because he had been wanting to do a story with us, and he knew that he was going to be coming out into the public arena, and we were the people that were going to do the print story for that to happen. So it was just a matter of timing of when he felt comfortable talking to me, and then eventually to Ralph as well. But that first conversation was in early March. And then it was a matter of us talking to him, learning, getting documents from him. We got a lot of documents from him, and learning who he was and what his story was. That was where we started. And then we tried to build the story by bringing in other sources. And there were more people we talked to than actually ended up in the story. We got a lot of support for him and talked to a lot of other people, and then decided, this is kind of the whole thing in a nutshell, Ralph, you can add to it, but then decided which people were going to be included along with him to kind of lend support and add their own independent views on the same topic that he was talking about.
I mean, let me say this, that Leslie and I talk all the time, every day, or sometimes multiple times a day on different stories. So we've been talking about, developments in UAP field for months, years, really, regularly. So this just sort of grew out of that.
Yeah, and he's making claims of non-human craft and bodies, potentially unknown pilot bodies, he said. Those are some extreme claims with no evidence to date. Can you speak to then, how you came to sourcing that information from him, and then also potentially what it's going to look like in the future if other documents will be released? Because I know he did give you a few, but are any photos or anything else going to come forward, hopefully and potentially in the coming weeks or months or maybe years?
I mean, just to start right off, we want to stay away from bodies. I assume you agree, Ralph, because that's not something we talked to him about. That's not something we would ever put in our story. And so if he wants to make that leap with somebody else, which is what he's done, I'm not going to be able to comment on that. And it's just not part of our story. I mean, our focus on our story is on the physical craft. And that's what he talked to us about. And obviously there can never be documents released that are specifically about a specific craft or specific studies done on a craft that reveal anything about locations or pictures. Absolutely not, because they're all classified. We know all that data exists, and that's the kind of information he provided to Congress and to the ICIG, the Inspector General for the intelligence community. And under oath, by the way, he talked to them. So that information is available, but not to us folks who don't have security clearances. Will it ever come out? We hope it will. And maybe Congress will gradually authorize the release of some of those documents, or whoever is in charge of them will authorize that. But at this point, they're all very, very closely held and highly protected through these.
I just want to add that the amazing thing is that we got so much that we could put into the article that was not classified. And, we got Dave's statements approved, or he got them approved by the Pentagon's Office of pre-publication release to clear this information with us. Not, they weren't saying that it was true or not. They were just saying it's okay for you to say this. It's not covered by any secrecy restrictions. But we got everything that we put in that story on the record and not classified. And that's what we regard as our real breakthrough, that we could get this stuff out there without breaking any laws, and through the restrictions on classification, which are onerous and protect all this material. So much of this stuff is classified and we don't know about it, but we got a lot of it on the record and usable.
Did he end up seeing anything with his own eyes? Because right now I believe it's just stories that he's heard and maybe potentially hearsay. But did he see any of these documents? Has he been witness to anything that's craft related or engineering of any type of technology?
I wouldn't call it hearsay, first of all. I mean, he has talked extensively, done many interviews with very high level people from inside the programs, and they've given him lots of details. So I think it isn't really fair to call it hearsay. I mean, it's direct communications that he's had with very deeply buried people from the programs themselves and others. And, I don't know specifically what he was shown in terms of whether he's seen photographs, what kind of classified documents he's shown. He has never mentioned seeing photographs. I don't think that means that he hasn't. because again, it's all about what his security clearances allow him to see. And there may be certain things he doesn't even want to reference that he's seen. So I'm on the responsibility. We don't really know for sure the answer to that question.
You know, there's things he couldn't even tell Congress, if you can imagine that. He said, you're not, in effect, he said to Congress, you're not cleared enough. You're not high up enough for me to tell you these things. So, you know, and we have that, and that's on the record. So, you know, he has very, very high security clearances. So we don't know what he saw or touched or, you know, was aware of, but certainly, as Leslie says, it's more than hearsay, because he put on the record and signed statements and testified under oath that he has this information, this knowledge directly, and he participated in the programs, and plus his credentials are amazing. You know, we had people vouching for him. We've seen his performance reports. So he is the real thing.
Can I just clarify something that Ralph said, though? It wasn't actually members of Congress that didn't have the clearances. It was staffers that didn't have the clearances. Right. Yeah. For some of the information, just to make that distinction, some of the information he provided, they weren't cleared to have access to, but I think there were members of Congress that probably were cleared. I don't know. And he didn't participate in the programs. He knows lots of people that did, but I mean, he was participated in the UAP task force. But yeah, I just want to, you know, just to be 100% clear for people listening, that when you said that, you weren't talking about that he was part of one of these crash retrieval programs, but he knows people who were direct information from them, basically. And he was part of the UAP task force. And of course, we don't know to what extent the task force, what they have access to and aren't telling us either. So, and that's where he did a lot of his work when he was employed there. So, you know, there's always this big wall around what's classified and what isn't. We only know a small percentage. What was it that Lou said, Ralph, about we only know maybe, what is it, 10%?
Tiny percent.
Incredibly. Yeah, the 90% of what we know is not available to the public, or some huge number like that.
And should be. We should talk about this later on, that this belongs to people of the world. I mean, apart from any direct national security data, which is probably, you know, you can say, well, that's arguably secret and ought to be classified. But as we say in the article, but the fact that these objects have been retrieved and exist and all that, that's not giving away any national security secrets. That is information that belongs to humanity.
I agree. And you're segueing exactly where I wanted to go, talking about mainstream media not picking this up yet, like slowly picking it up. But in the beginning, when you were looking to see that story and outside of the debrief, and we appreciate that it obviously came to us, but we know the Washington Post didn't pass on this. So let's clarify that. But let's talk about, you know, why you felt the pressure that you needed to put it out right away, because we see that tons of people are asking that question, and try to clarify and not make a conspiracy theory that, you know, you were pressured to do this, but instead, why did you feel the pressure individually, not by other people, to release this so fast?
I don't think we can reveal all the reasons. I mean, it has to do with a lot of placement of various media that's going to be coming after and so on. But the main reason was because there were leaks that were developing. Even Dave's name came out. One of the other people in I think it was actually on an interview you did with Danny Sheehan, actually. And there were there were just leaks that were building and building and building. And our source, Dave Grusch, was starting to get nervous. He was starting to get strange phone calls. There were, you know, people were making weird comments about FBI raids. And it was just like the tension was just building for him. You know, he'd been waiting for so long that it just got to a point where the leaking process we were worried about, that somebody might go out and try to do a story about him that presented him in a negative light, for instance, or lie about him in the media. I mean, people do all kinds of horrible things. So we just felt this urgency at a certain point. We just had to get it out. And that's what he wanted as well. And you may want to add to that, Ralph. I don't know, but that's essentially the picture.
You know, this is well grounded, because one of his complaints officially was that he was retaliated against illegally under the whistleblower statute. He is not supposed to have been retaliated against for information he gave through proper channels, but he was. He suffered retaliation, details of which we did not go into for his protection in the story. But so that was another factor. You know, as a journalist, we know that the best way to protect a source, once he or she gives you, important information, is to put that information out there, get it on the record, because until that happens, a source is really vulnerable to all kinds of pressure. And as Leslie said, he was receiving all kinds of, threats and other things. And we needed to get his information out there. So we lost the option. And the internet, as you know, can be a savage place. There's a lot of people there. It's unpoliced. We know that. It's good that it's open to all these different voices. It's a great strength of the internet. Anyone can be a journalist. Anyone can publish anything. That's great. But of course, it's not always verified. And we have been the victims ourselves in previous reporting of stuff that came out on the internet that undercut us, that embarrassed us, that looked to preempt us. People have different motives, rivals, colleagues. So it was getting really untenable. We had to get this information out, and we could not wait for the processes of some other organizations, which were proper in their, that's their protocols. But we had to move ahead to protect, Dave. And that was a really huge factor.
Oh, yeah. Are there any legal repercussions that might happen to Dave? Because we know that he was allowed to go forward and speak to that. And I would love to talk to you also to explain first why he was allowed, because we're hearing different things. Obviously, Susan Goff just sent a quote, and I'll put that up too, released a quote from the Pentagon. She's the Pentagon spokeswoman, to say that this is not, not discredit him, but, and that's a huge thing we should know, not discredit him, but to say that AARO is, looking to be open to talk to people and just really kind of put out a blank statement. So let's speak a little bit about to that, and then potentially what these repercussions could be, because he is protected under the, under the Whistleblower Protection Act for him within legislation. But what happens now? Will he have any legal repercussions potentially in the future that you could see of?
It's just, I don't think so. Personally, I think he's very well protected now that he's getting out there in the public. And
he's
now
a great lawyer. I mean, he has a lawyer who's a previous inspector general of the intelligence community, who's really plugged in. So he is represented very ably by an extremely high-level counsel. So I think, again, by putting his story out, the debrief protected him.
Right. And then it's picked up everywhere else. And so his name becomes familiar. And then anybody that knows that if they try to do something to him, it's going to become news. And, the law is really in effect now. He's already spoken to Congress, whereas when he was retaliated against before, he had not done that yet. That was all before he spoke to Congress. So it's a different world now for him. And I just can't imagine that anything like that. And he's also not in government anymore. That's another big change. When the things happened to him before, he was still in government. So some of the places he was working for weren't happy with the fact that he was speaking out, right? Or that he was looking for information or whatever it was. But now that he's an independent person, I think he's also more protected in a certain way. There's less threat on him.
So why was he allowed then to come forward and speak to this? Why was that? Like, I know there's people that obviously don't want it, but what was the process of this being allowed through government?
Well, I don't think they had a lot of choice, because it was embarrassing for them, the government, I mean, the Pentagon, to know that he was out there, had this information. And it was not, he wasn't speaking about classified things. I mean, his statements were approved on an unclassified level. We have that documentation. So there really wasn't an awful lot they could do. And properly so. I think, we're in a free country. We have freedom of speech. We're allowed to say certain things as long as we don't give away national secrets, classified information. And again, this was information that was so basic and so earth-shattering, about retrieved craft, that there was really nothing they could do to stop him.
There's nobody that either allows him to do anything or not allows him. He's a private citizen.
I'm glad you clarified that, because I know a lot of people are saying, if the government saying that he can, and it's just a weird place right now where you have like Susan Goff saying one thing, and obviously there's other stuff going on where people are saying that he can go forward in the government and have those conversations.
I mean, there's nobody controlling him or telling him what to do. He left government, and I think it was on April 7th. So
it's good.
imagines for himself what he's doing, you know?
And he
Yeah, I think-
knows
yeah.
the constraints against him, just like, Lou Elizondo, when we talked to him at great length, he knew what he could say and couldn't say. And he put a lot of stuff on the record that he was allowed to say as a citizen. And he withheld a lot of stuff that he didn't tell us because it was covered by, classified restraints and protections. So we've encountered this situation before.
Now, the whole conversation about whistleblowers, we've heard there's multiple, obviously not just one right now with Dave, but does this open up the floodgate then for whistleblowers to come forward? But I asked that, and I would imagine that would be a yes. But when we look at whistleblowers, there's variations of different stories that will generally potentially come out. How do we vet those stories to be true? Because anybody could make up a lie or create misinformation or forms of disinformation that turn into misinformation. How do we vet that? And what is that process going to look like? And are we doing that as people, or do we have to look to the government to help us do that as well and maybe work together?
Well, I mean, I think, first of all, we have to make a distinction between a whistleblower and a witness. So a whistleblower is somebody who's actually accusing the government of wrongdoing. But if you're somebody who's just coming forward and saying, I have this information, but I'm not accusing the government of anything, then you're a witness, not a whistleblower. And the term whistleblower is kind of tossed around a lot very casually. I think, one way you can vet them is whether they've spoken to Congress and or Arrow, certainly is an important question, because if you want to give someone that credibility and that, you're going to willing to seriously consider them as legitimate, then if they have spoken to either one of those bodies or both, I would think that means something. They're unlikely that they're going to go in there and lie, right? Even though they're not under oath, it's unlikely. So to me, that would be one question I would always ask someone if they suddenly come forward, is whether they have communicated with either Arrow or Congress. And other than that, all you can do is ask for documentation and do in-depth interviews to try to assess the veracity of what they're saying and try to get other people to corroborate that and talk to other people who know that person. I mean, it's a long process. Yeah.
But I mean, it's very important to note that we don't know all the people who've come forward. That's not a public record. As a matter of fact, we have a quote in our story saying that members of Congress are prohibited from disclosing the identities of witnesses and whistleblowers. So we don't know all the people who've come forward, and that's classic. What they say and who they are is also protected. So we don't know all that stuff. If somebody comes forward to us and says, I testified to Congress about, UAP or whatever, we go through the process of getting their, of vetting them, getting their credentials, getting their performance records, which is why, by the way, everything in our story was named sources on the record, backed up by documentation, no unnamed sources. And that, I think, gives our reporting strength that you don't always find, you don't find on the internet, for example, because there's a lot of anonymous stuff floating around. May be true, may not be true. You never, there's no way of telling, but we've laid it out in our story because that's our training as journalists, naming people, showing their background, getting other people to vouch for them. So again, we don't know all the other people who come forward. We haven't documented that.
And I think hopefully we'll see more people coming forward in the next again, weeks, months, years, and with their stories. And hopefully then, we can make hopefully they're credible stories, and we can have evidence, to back those as well and move forward, and mainstream media picks it up. Has sorry, say it again?
No, I was just saying absolutely, and I think that should happen. I think Dave's just going to be starting the ball rolling, and hopefully others will be encouraged to come forward. Absolutely.
Yeah, he's given strength to other people, and I think he lit a fire under Congress, because he's basically said, Congress, you have been lied to. You have not been told the truth, and here is the truth. We have that in our story that he has basically told Congress that they have not had access to the information that they legally deserve to have about UAP. So maybe now, little by little, this fire will be lit. Other people will be emboldened to come forward, and that I would guess that would be the case.
We look at other potential whistleblowers from the past in the early 80s, and we'll look at Bob Lazar, obviously, as being one. And this might be a direct question, and kind of direct question, but is Dave the new Bob Lazar? Would he be considered that? Because right now, that's kind of what people are saying or hearing. there's similar things to what he's saying. Exactly. And does this corroborate Bob Lazar's story?
I would say no to both of those questions, but I mean, because, Dave has spoken to Congress provided 11 hours of oral testimony. I don't think Bob Lazar has done that. Dave has, he's filed a complaint with the ICIG, which was ruled in his favor, urgent and credible and urgent. I mean, it's just another level. I mean, I'm not dissing Bob Lazar at all, but I don't think he has the kind of credential and openly engaging with the government, providing documents. Lots of people know him. It's just a whole different level of kind of activity. And I don't think what they're saying really is similar either. I mean, he's not talking about one specific crashed object in a hangar in one location. It's a much broader expose than that. But that would be an interesting question to ask David, how he sees himself in relation to Bob Lazar. But I don't see him in the same universe, really. I don't know, Ralph, you might have
not to diss Bob Lazar. I mean, first of all, Bob Lazar said he put his hands on Kraft, right? I mean, he actually physically saw and interacted with Kraft, and Dave is not saying that. But also, Dave came from very, very high level, intelligence agencies, which we documented. He worked for different agencies. He worked with the UAP task force. He worked with the, national, geographic
space intelligence. Yeah, the NGA, National Geospatial Intelligence, all the alphabet soup of agencies. But again, we documented his service record, plus he, decorated war veteran in Afghanistan and all that. So, we choose to feature the stories of people who we can document fully. They not only have very important information, but whose bona fides we can, document really very compellingly and get other people to vouch for them. So I'm not saying that, who we didn't feature because they didn't measure up to that, but Dave does measure up to that. And Lou Elizondo did measure up to that when we featured him in the New York Times. So these are the people, we hear lots of stories all the time. As I said, Leslie and I talk all the time about, where we're going to go in our reporting, but we tend to, try to put our efforts on those cases where we are, just fully able to document their service histories and their information. And I think an interesting question would be whether Bob Lazar is going to go provide testimony to Arrow, say. I mean, why wouldn't he do that?
I've asked the same question on some of my podcasts as well. Is Bob Lazar going to do that? And I hope he does. I really do. And we'll see. I think that shows his level of credibility if he decides to go on the record and testify. So I think you're right. Yeah.
But I'm not second guessing him. I mean, if he doesn't, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. I'm sure he has all kinds of reasons for what he does. I'm not trying to draw judgment at all.
Everybody has to make their own make their own call on this. And it's obviously extremely difficult to come forward. Dave, really risked a lot to do that, to come forward on the record. So not everybody's willing to do that, and we're not judging those who don't, but we certainly like to, give credence and attention to those who do.
Avril Haines is the national director of intelligence. So you might know this or not, but I believe it was last year, a year before, maybe even 2 years ago, she did a talk called Our Future in Space with theoretical physicist Avi Loeb. She did it with some theologians as well. And it also, I forget who else was there. Bill Nelson was there, NASA administrator. So right there was tons of people in the National Cathedral Church in Washington speaking about the concept of what this is going to look like from a theologian perspective and through like a science perspective. Do you think that Avril Haines, and it says, I believe in the article, that she was informed. Do you think that she's actually, and I know that this is all just speculation and just a question that you're not 100% potentially sure, but do you think she knew of this way in advance and was hosting these types of conferences that really on YouTube was only watched about 4,000 people when I watched it? It wasn't nationally broadcast, which I thought was interesting, but it had a conversation, a really deep conversation about the theology of this. Do you think that Avril Haines potentially might have known way more, and doing these types of conferences is generally doing a slow trickle of this topic and looking at it from a cultural perspective?
I hear this a lot. As a lifelong journalist and New York Times reporter, I do not really believe in these conspiracies, that this was all thought out in advance, that this is, a plot to trickle out the information. I mean, we obviously don't know what Avril Haines knew or didn't know, but I tend not to believe that the people who assert that our story was planted, or that, people leaked this to us at a particular time for a particular effect. I know that's not true, because I know how our stories, originate through hard reporting, digging, sometimes chance. So I would tend not to believe that she had some kind of master plan to, plant the seeds at this, conference with Bill Nelson, et cetera. I also want to say, by the way, it's great that NASA is finally in this discussion, because for a long time they were missing in action, but we can take that up later. But so to answer your question directly, I don't know how Leslie feels about this, but I'll tell you, I do not believe that these things are, sort of hand-fed to reporters or plotted long in advance, because we just don't know. How would she know that Dave Grusch was going to, decide to come forward? Who knew that? Anyway, he didn't know it. He didn't know himself till he decided to do it. So anyway, that's my take on it. Maybe Leslie has a different take, but.
No, I mean, I can't comment because it's all speculation. I agree with you, Ralph. But we do know that she did receive, or her office received, a copy of the classified version of the complaint, the ICIG complaint that he filed in May of 2022. So she did receive that, and of course the classified version has all the information that he provided, similar to what he provided to Congress. So, for whatever that's worth.
That was after that conference with.
I guess it was after the conference, but but just in general to speculate. Yeah, I guess you're right, but just to speculate in general, just to add that we know she did get a copy of that.
Right.
Yeah. So let's even talk about the timeline. I'd be curious to know when, because we look at the legislation and we know that the legislation has a 72-hour activation mode that then it's informed to different people within the different agencies. So I'm curious, because we don't really know what propels that. So I'd be curious to see what that timeline looked like, if you can share it with me, of when he decided to then testify and go on the record and under oath, and then where we ended up now being informing different people within Senate and Intel committees. How long was that process?
I think it was, I mean, and I might not have it, it's all in the story. I might not have it exactly in my brain, but as I recall, it was in 2021 that he first went to the IG for the DOD and filed a complaint there. And that complaint, quote, was about illegal activity on the part of the U.S. government because these programs have been concealed. So he basically went to file that they have these programs and they've been hiding the information from the government, and that's illegal. And after he did that, that's when he started to get these reprisals happening, that somehow that information leaked and he doesn't know how that happened. And then, so over the next year, he was just constantly dealing with horrible things that we're not going to talk about because the investigation is ongoing, but really, really bad stuff. And so then in May of 2022, he filed a reprisal with the ICIG, or a complaint, I'm sorry, which dealt with the reprisals that he had received the previous year, as well as the information that he had. So there were two components of what he was providing. One was just the information about the programs and the crash retrievals. And the second was the information about the reprisals that had been taken against him. And so that was the second complaint. So that was like May of 22. So that was like a year ago that he filed that. And then he started talking a lot to Congress after that second May 2022 complaint was filed. Then the copies of the classified version were sent around. They were sent to both the intelligence committees, both the House and Senate. And then he started having these closed door meetings with the staffers and members of Congress, and then continued to do that over the next year. That's how I understand the timeline. Again, if I got anything wrong, it is in the story.
I think that's exactly right, Leslie. And of course, we don't know all the things he told Congress behind closed doors because that's all classified. So for the people who say, well, he hasn't provided anything, you know, we don't know what he provided. That's right, it's classified. But that doesn't mean that it's not important.
Oh, for sure.
Probably really important. It's just that we don't get to see it.
Yeah.
You know. And there was a lot of it. I mean, there were hundreds of pages of material that of information that he provided. A lot of information.
Do you know how we go about then, since this has come forward, how to classify documents like that? Like, obviously the government it will take some time for that to happen, but how is that even pushed to then obviously come forward? Is it just because of the pressure that's been put on with obviously this story and the amount of pressure that they're going to have to deal with? Or is it something that they're just going to say, we're probably not going to do this and not unclassify any information?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, Congress can obviously subpoena information. The Congress can obtain information. I guess to some extent they might influence the declassification. I'm not familiar with all the ins and outs of that process. Who would have to do that? But certainly we hope that our story will embolden members of Congress to do what they're elected to do, which is find out on behalf of the American people what's going on and to open doors that are closed to them. I mean, one of Dave's claims and complaints is that Congress was illegally kept in the dark by the government, by the executive branch, by the Pentagon. So now maybe members of Congress will assert their constitutional rights to be informed about these things. This is money, of course, that is involved here, that belongs to the American taxpayer. So if Congress now demands that some of this information be opened up, that will probably go a long way.
Oh yeah, and multiple people would be going to jail.
Could
if they release classified information, yes. That's why they can't do it.
Or if they withheld information illegally, because that's a crime. I mean, Congress is entitled to certain information, which is Dave's point, and to withhold that information from Congress, that is a crime.
Yeah, right. And they're saying over 90 years, though, that this has been held against the American people and not knowing. That's a lot of people.
It's a lot of time. And, the government has played a very sordid role here. We have to say that in concealing the truth from the American people. I'm not talking about classified information. I'm talking about basic facts. They've had a government policy through various administrations going back to World War II and earlier to ridicule this phenomenon, to stigmatize it, to pressure the media not to run these stories. And basically, it put a cloud over the entire field, which we still feel today. People are reluctant to come forward. And that's only because the government was afraid to say that we don't know what this phenomenon is. We can't protect the American people from something we don't know, what it is. If they'd only said that, it would have probably encouraged people to come forward long before this. So there's been a long history of disinformation, misinformation, and really, which is, I'm not the first one to say this. But it's a very sad history, and we're suffering the consequences of it today.
Is there any possible way that this could be a disinformation campaign?
Recruited Dave into a disinformation campaign and gotten all the people like Carl Nell, the colonel who vouched for him, and Jonathan Gray, the other source we have in the story, who vouched for him. You'd have to get all these people together. This is what I was saying before about conspiracy theories, which I don't believe after my career as a reporter. You'd have to get so many people to agree on a story and a fake story and disinformation. It's just ludicrous. Anything is possible. Could you say, is it no, it's not impossible. It's just extremely unlikely because of the way we trace the bona fides of all these people.
Yeah, and too many people know Dave Grusch for that to be the case. That's
for sure.
It's too highly respected within the intelligence community for that to happen.
We've seen a lot of people come forward even after the story went live, that people have come forward and have said, how about him, and said many, many positive things about him and his ethics. Has anybody in Congress or government or related to government, not even just obviously media would reach out to you, but anybody that's former government or in government right now has reached out to you in the past 24 hours about this story?
We don't talk about that.
That's fair enough.
I mean,
Yeah,
we talk to people all the time.
Yeah.
You know, who we talk to and for what. I mean, that's not something we feel comfortable discussing who we've talked to and, about what.
That's fair. Can I ask then, what is a DOPSA review? Because that has been mentioned, and I just like to clarify it for people who, myself and others, might not be familiar with that term or acronym.
Okay, that's the Defense Office of Pre-Publication and Security Review. And they decide whether somebody who had been privy to classified information can talk about the subject, to what extent that person can, reveal details about it. And Dave submitted the fact that he wanted to give us information, talk to us about his testimony to Congress and to the Pentagon. And quite properly cleared it with that office beforehand and said, I plan to say this and this and this to the reporters, Leslie Kean and Ralph Blumenthal. They don't rule on the truth and falsity of that. They just say, does this violate any security, guidelines? And they said in documents that we obtained, no, you can say this, this, and this. And it laid out exactly what he wanted to say and what they said he could say. So I think that strengthened our story in that we can report that the government, the Pentagon, knew what he was telling us and did not object on security grounds. So I think that's important. It adds a level of verification that we were very careful to get because again, it confirms that we weren't dealing in classified information and that the information that we were reporting had been cleared just for this kind of publication in the debrief with the government. So we felt another level of confidence and security in the reliability of our information. I think it gave us a very strong feeling of confidence that what we were reporting he was saying was at least true.
And Lou Elizondo did something similar to this, I believe, with his book too, just so people, so that he could go forward and release his book hopefully next year, or maybe the end of this year, we'll see.
And the skinwalkers in the Pentagon, same thing. I mean, anybody who's worked within the intelligence world and then wants to write a book, they all have to get it reviewed to make sure there's nothing in there that is violating classification rules. So skinwalkers, I remember they were tied up for quite a while going through this review process.
I'm not surprised.
Yeah, it might be a different office that handles books as opposed to shorter things. I don't know, but it's the same kind of process. Yeah.
And I think that added to the wow factor of our story because people were saying, wow, the government is letting this guy say this. Wow, they're letting him say. So, it sounds like, I guess maybe a normal reader's reaction might be, oh, nobody would allow him to say this. So how could he say this? And they let him say it. They didn't endorse it, but they said it doesn't violate any, secrecy statutes. So again, we were very pleased to have that level of disclosure in our piece, and I think it added to the power of the story that came out.
Where do we go next now with this story? Where does the government have to go for us to obviously have more? We'll use the word disclosure, such a buzzword in the UFO community, and then where do the people go next with learning all this information? Because it really is. If this is the first article you ever read about this topic, you're going to go through a massive paradigm shift, and it could change everything how you see the world and everything that you believe in.
Yeah. So I guess where we go next is what we hope, where we hope we go next, because we can't predict, is that others will come forward like Dave, that the case for the reality of crash retrievals and these legacy programs will become stronger. And as a result, there will be more hearings, for instance, that perhaps Dave and others will be called to an open hearing in Congress. And that there may be, as we talked about, declassification of some documentation about this, and just greater transparency. Then it's just going to be a gradual process that's going to unfold. And, that's best case scenario. Of course, we can't predict. I mean, worst case scenario is that everything just gets shut down. And there's some way that it's, that these witnesses are prevented from coming forward. And there are forces out there that don't want this to happen and have a lot of power to do harm to people.
you know, but
No, it's hard to predict it, but I like to put forward the positive scenario and say this is what should happen and is probably will happen. That's how I see it. Sorry.
And I want to just add to that, absolutely right, that you have to think of how far we've come, and just in the few years since, you know, we broke the story in the New York Times. Now the government has officially said that these objects are real. They physically exist. They're not hallucinations. They're not, you know, fly specks on the windshield of, you know, fighter craft. These are true enigmas. They can't be explained by anything we've, you know, understood so far. They operate not only in the air, apparently, but underwater, because they changed the name of the office to the All Domain, you know, Anomaly Office. So these things are operating in a variety of media, air, water, and but they're real. They're not figments of imagination. They're not hallucinations. They're not fabrications. They're not hoaxes. They are something that cannot be explained by our current understanding. And that's only within the last few years, because, you know, before that, the government was saying, well, these, you know, people are faking these reports, or they're demented, or they're mentally ill. And that was the stigma all along. Well, now we've gone beyond that. The government has officially said, you know, in the reports it's put out, that these objects are real. We can't explain them. Some we can explain. A lot we can explain, or can be explained finally by natural phenomena, but a lot we can't. And that's how far we've come. And I think that it's nice to look at the positive side and say, well, we haven't figured it all out. We haven't gotten all the answers by a long shot, but at least we're not back to the days when the government was putting out this and getting away with it, putting out this disinformation and misinformation.
100%. And we're in the right step forward, I think. Thank you so much, both of you, Les and Ralph, to joining me on Rebelliously Curious today. And I can't wait to see what else happens with this article. So again, thank you for joining me.
Thank you.
Chris.
Last week, NASA held its first public meeting on UFOs, which, by the way, are now called officially unidentified aerial phenomena. This is a year after launching a study into unexplained sightings. And now tonight, a worldwide TV exclusive you will only see right here on News Nation. Bombshell claims from a military whistleblower published just this morning, alleging a secret UFO retrieval program within the U.S. government. David Grusch, an Air Force veteran, former member of that task force, and veteran of the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, now formally blowing the whistle on secrets he says no one has ever shared publicly before. He is speaking one-on-one with investigative reporter Ross Coulthart, reporting for News Nation.
When you say crash retrieval, what do you mean?
These are retrieving non-human origin technical vehicles, you know, call it spacecraft if you will. It's probably not the right parlance, but no kidding, non-human, exotic origin vehicles that have either landed or crashed.
We have spacecraft from another species.
We do, yeah.
How many?
Quite a number.
All right, tune into Vargas tonight at 6 p.m. Eastern, a worldwide TV exclusive you will only see on News Nation.
Thank you for watching. Go to newsnationnow.com to find News Nation on your television provider. And don't forget to click the red subscribe button below to get more of News Nation's fact-driven, unbiased coverage.
Do we have bodies? Do we have species of
Well,
non-human?
naturally, when you recover something that's either landed or crashed, sometimes you encounter dead pilots. And believe it or not, as fantastical as that sounds, it's true.